When you call your nearest Rolex dealer, it is usually answered by a nice and professional retail assistant that'll make you think you will find what you're looking for, only to find out that there is a 6-month waiting list for that particular model. Over the past few years, this waiting list thing has raised a lot of questions from all the Rolex enthusiasts out there. So has it always been like this? Can this list be avoided? Most importantly, does this list even exist? Well, to answer these questions, we'll need to understand a lot more about Rolex, its distribution network and supply chain, and its very special place at the throne of the luxury watch market. Let's get started. So was there always a waiting list? No way. Back in the 1990s, you could just walk into a Rolex store and pick up a steel Datejust or a Rolex Submariner, no date at the regular price, and maybe even get a discount. Fast forward about 20 years, and that whole scenario has become something like an urban legend. So, let's dive into what we actually know about how Rolex makes and sells its watches. This should help us make sense of how the whole idea of a Rolex waiting list came about in the last couple of decades. Oh, and I've got to let you in on something. That whole concept of a Rolex waiting list? Well, it's not exactly a straightforward thing. Or at least there aren't any clear rules that we can figure out. To put it in simple terms, the whole idea of the Rolex waiting list boils down to the basic economics of how the market works, the interplay between supply and demand. To break it down further, especially when it comes to watches, especially the luxurious ones like Rolex, their popularity has skyrocketed over the past 10 years. But here's the catch. The demand for Rolex watches is way higher than what Rolex actually produces, which is roughly around 1 million watches each year. Take a moment to really absorb that fact. That million watch figure gets thrown around a lot as the supposed production number, but interestingly, Rolex hasn't officially confirmed it. Much like its competitors in the luxury watch realm, Rolex keeps its data under wraps and doesn't reveal how many watches it churns out annually. Now, if we look at other players in the luxury watch scene, their production numbers are all over the map. Most of them create around 100,000 watches or even fewer per year. And then there's Tissot, which cranks out about 3.5 million watches, though at a much lower price range. If we assume that the 1 million estimates for Rolex are on point, that puts them in the same ballpark as Omega, Longines, Tag Heuer, and Cartier when it comes to production numbers. But here's the interesting part. Those brands usually don't have waiting lists, except for their absolute top-tier models that everyone covets. So, you might wonder, with such crazy demand, why doesn't Rolex just increase its production? Well, that's where delving into the nitty-gritty of the Rolex manufacturing process comes into play. Let's explore that to get a better grasp of the situation. So, you know how Rolex watches are pretty pricey compared to other brands that make similar watches? Well, that's because Rolex has this special way of making their watches. They have their own manufacturing process where they make a lot of the stuff they need right in their own facilities. For instance, the gold and platinum they use for their fancy watches are actually produced in their own little foundry. They make sure these metals don't easily get messed up, and they shine really bright. The steel they use, called oyster steel, is super tough and shiny too, even though they don't make it themselves. Oh, and those super strong and good-looking ceramic bezels they started using not long ago? Those are also their own special thing. You might be wondering if they can just get more materials like gold, steel, and ceramic. Can't they make more watches? Well, it's a bit more complicated. See, Rolex has a lot of their manufacturing process automated. They use machines to make most of the parts, and then skilled watchmakers put everything together really carefully. It's like a mix of handmade work and machines. This means Rolex can probably adjust how many watches they make more easily than other luxury brands. Take Patek Philippe, for example. They rely a lot on skilled workers to make their watches, so they can't change their production as quickly. Now you might think, if Rolex can make more watches, why don't they just do it? Well, they've actually said that they don't want to. Even though it seems possible, Rolex doesn't plan on making a whole bunch more watches than they already do. The thing is, the company's claims regarding top-notch quality in their field, totally backed up and proven. I mean, those Rolex timepieces, the way they put together the movements, cases, and bracelets is like next-level perfection. It's become the gold standard that tons of other companies are striving for. We're not here to school them on their job because it's pretty darn evident that they've got the whole watchmaking game figured out. But here's the twist. Rolex isn't out there directly selling to folks like you and me. They've made it clear that their official retailers are the ones calling the shots when it comes to who gets their hands on those coveted watches. Each of these retailers, they're in charge of how they handle their own Rolex waiting list, or even if they have one in the first place. So, how the Rolex supply chain impacts the Rolex waiting list. You know, when it comes to Rolex, they're quite secretive about how they get their watches out there. But here's the scoop. There are basically two main types of stores that sell Rolex watches. First, you've got these old-school multi-brand places called Rolex Authorized Dealers, or ADs. Then, there are these newer spots called Rolex boutiques, where they only sell Rolex stuff. Now get this, both of these types of stores aren't usually owned by Rolex itself. They're run by independent business folks. But wait, there's a twist. Some of those fancy Rolex boutiques are actually owned by Rolex directly, or sometimes by a combo of Rolex and a local store that's been around the block. The way they work is pretty clever. Instead of setting up their own stores everywhere, Rolex kind of does this mix and match thing. They team up with trusted partners who buy their watches in bulk at a special price and then sell them to regular folks like us at the suggested retail price. It's like how any other distributor does it, nothing too crazy. But you know, something most folks who buy Rolex watches might not be aware of is how tightly controlled the way Rolex gets their watches out there is. It's like this package deal they use to send out groups of watches together. Now here's the kicker. In these packages, you've got the super popular ones that everyone's after, and then you've got the ones that aren't as in demand. So, if a dealer's aiming to get a particular watch for a customer, they can't just grab it on its own. Nope, they've got to snag a whole package, which includes that watch the customer wants and a couple of the not-so-hot ones. Those are a bit trickier to sell, you know. Not the first choice for most folks. When you're dealing with an authorized dealer for Rolex, they're the ones who get to decide how they give out their watches to customers. That's why these dealers find it useful to keep track of folks who are interested in specific watch models. This way, when those watches finally come in, they can easily match them up with interested customers. Now, keep in mind that each authorized dealer or Rolex boutique operates independently. So if you're on a waiting list at one store, it doesn't affect the waiting lists at other Rolex stores, even if they're in the same city. There are some exceptions, though. You've got these big jewelry chains like Tiffany and Tourneau, and they often share their inventory and can guide customers to different stores within their network to find that special watch. A lot of these dealers stash away a collection of watches in their safes. They bring them out when someone wants to try them on, and then they tuck them away again. It's all about making the buying process smooth. If a valued customer wants a Rolex, having it on hand can really seal the deal. Whether an authorized dealer keeps a formal waiting list, an informal mental list, or no list at all, it's totally up to them. And even if they do have a list, they're not necessarily bound to follow it to the letter. So when you hear about getting on a Rolex waiting list, it usually means you've shown interest in a specific model to an authorized dealer. Hopefully, when that watch arrives, they'll remember your interest and give you a heads up. If you want to know how you can try avoiding the waiting list, watch this video and remember to subscribe.